Welcome to the last webinar of 2020 in our series 2021 Health and Wellness Will Be Different. Thank you so much for joining for today's topic, water, not enough everywhere. In a world where COVID, sustainability and wellness are the hot issues affecting so many health and wellness marketeers, we sometimes forget the next new normal for all brands is and will be the water footprint. Today, we will look at some of the issues arising from the world's water shortage and how our time during COVID has highlighted what we, as health and wellness marketeers, will need to do when thinking about our water policies for the future to build responsible businesses. Before diving in today, I would very much like to encourage you to think about these 4 questions while listening to our presentation and discussion. What excites you? What concerns you? What would you like to know more about, and what ideas do you have? Please feel free to pop those questions, ideas, and any thoughts in our chat, as our speakers will answer any questions towards the end of the session. We're very honoured and excited to have 3 thought leaders for today's webinar. First, let me introduce you to Dr. Randall Shannon, full-time lecturer, PhD scholar and Programme Director of Marketing, plus co-director of the International Programme at McCaughan University. He specialises in cross-cultural consumer behaviour and retailing, conducting market research in the region for over 25 years, as well as publishing over 150 conference papers and international journal articles. His interest in research has shifted towards sustainability, and he is the perfect person to share stories about the rising issues like water with us today. Secondly, let me introduce you to Dave McCaughan. Founder of Bibliosexual, Dave has had over 30 years experience in marketing and advertising. He is a brilliant speaker, consultant, strategy planner, and well-seasoned market researcher. His interest and passion geared towards sustainability, people, including aging markets, and the future of consumer healthcare. He is an amazing storyteller, which you'll all find out very soon. Last but not least, I would like to introduce you to Steve Sowerby, the founder of Exponential and the co-founder of the Consumer Healthcare Training Academy. Steve has a strong background in consumer healthcare and is a highly experienced marketer and general manager with over 30 years of corporate and agency experience. With his belief that people are the most important research in the organization, for over 15 years, he's been invited to speak and train companies around the world in both healthcare and non-healthcare industries. Thank you so much for hosting today. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our speakers for today, Dr. Randall, Dave, and Steve.
Thank you very much, Emma. Perfect start to unbelievably the last of the webinars for 2020. When we started in June, we didn't imagine the number of topics and the great debate and participation from around the world on these elements, which ultimately help us to build better health and wellness for our communities. So welcome to Randall and Dave. Great to have you with us today. And Dave, unusual because normally you're here moderating with me, but today we're going to put you on the pedestal and we're going to really with Randall share something which really has been perhaps strange when we connect it to health and wellness. But still, it is one of the more growing issues that we're going to have to live with, and indeed we are living with, as we'll find out. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, this is a really interesting subject, Steve. It's something that Randall and I have talked about a lot over the last 6 months or so, because we've known each other for quite a long while, but in a conversation it sort of came up as something that we both sort of went, oh yeah, hadn't really thought about it enough. And we've ended up swapping a lot of stories, and we're going to share a few of the facts and stories today. Can we just go to the next chart, please? Steve mentioned that, we've been doing this series of webinars for about 6 months since June. And in the very first one, we were talking about things that meant that 2021 was not a normal year. And one of the things that came up about that was toilets. And the fact that we had seen dramatic increases in the cleaning of toilets in public spaces, the reshaping, the re-architecture of toilets in public spaces. And that's all true. Steve, what was it you mentioned when we were waiting to get online?
I was just saying, how quickly many of the shopping malls here in Bangkok removed the doors to the entrance to the toilets. Not, of course, the doors to the cubicles, but removed the doors because we had discussed in almost that first webinar that the doors were one of the most dirty, if you like, places in the toilets in these public malls. And yet they reacted very quickly, and literally within a couple of months, these doors were disappearing. And obviously that had a strong impact in terms of making sure that we weren't transmitting any infections through that media.
But of course, as we've, through COVID, et cetera, this year, thought about more about toilets, maybe seeing some more cleansing of toilets, more sanitation. For most of us on this call, more emphasis on sanitation. We sometimes forget that the amount of water that's going through a toilet hasn't changed. And that toilets, we're flushing maybe more, we're washing our hands more, etc. But all of that is just adding up to greater and greater water consumption. And that's one way to start this conversation. It also links to something that Randall's been working on. If you go to the next chart, please. And Randall, maybe you can explain sustainability in terms of these 18 goals and what you've been doing.
You want me to put the audience to sleep already, Dave?
Yeah, something like that.
Well, the United Nations put together these Sustainable Development Goals, and they set this time frame, which now has actually been revised because of COVID. They said basically our goals are going to have to be extended. And there's 18 different goals, and they're very worthy. But today we're talking about number 6, which is about water. And most of the time I focus more on number 12, which is about consumer behavior and not over consuming. So they go together. But basically they're saying we all need to think about our consumption patterns today to make sure that we do not infringe or in any way affect people in the future. Our consumption patterns today should not in any way affect people in the future. And I think that's a very difficult thing to achieve, but that's what we're discussing.
Yeah. Very interesting. And I mentioned to you just before we came on the call, Randall, I think, let's say pre-2020, everyone had sustainability and was on mind, and they were building this into their strategy. And sustainability, also known at that time as plastics. What are we going to do about the plastics in the world? And the whole of industries were united in finding strategies on how can we reduce plastic waste, how can we recycle, how can we be more honest in terms of what we do in terms of our plastics. Whereas then suddenly with COVID, all of that sort of started to sort of die down, and we started to worry much more about, staying safe, staying healthy. And now what I'm seeing is that people have realized that sustainability is probably better termed responsibility, doing things responsibly. And that's more a holistic view of many of these goals and how a company can be working across many of these areas to create products, to communicate, to offer services in a responsible way. I would love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really complicated and somewhat confusing, because if you compare and contrast something like a plastic bag versus a paper bag versus a cloth bag, and you factor in how much is actually used in producing it and how many times you're going to use it, it just throws everything up in the air. And Dave and I are very easily amused, but we've had some interesting conversations about how, plastic came along and replaced glass, and it gave us many benefits. But true, when it ends up in the oceans or people start to burn it or whatnot, it creates a lot of headaches. But it actually brought us a lot of benefits. It's not the ultimate evil. So we have to be, I like to use the word mindful, but I think your term is good as well. You know, we just have to be responsible and mindful about how we consume, how much we consume, how we dispose, even things like debt, you know, long term. You know?
Yeah, very good. So I think one of the messages from here is, you know, think responsibly, act responsibly. Or mindfully, if we use your term, Randall. I think, you know, it's not just about plastic. It goes much broader than that. Dave, back to you.
And I think that's probably a good setup, because what we're going to talk about over the next 45, 50 minutes is the context of water, and how water sometimes is, there's a whole bunch of aspects of water that we take for granted, or that we don't realize. And it offers a lot of issues, but also a lot of opportunities for businesses, particularly, I think, in the health and wellness area. So let's go to the next chart. Thanks. You know, we want to talk about water sustainability here and clean water sustainability, because basically it's a huge problem. Right? I mean, the simple act of me sitting here with a glass of, you know, clean tap water. I'm here in Sydney, by the way, and tap water in Sydney is very drinkable. And so I'm lucky that I'm here. If I was in Bangkok, where I normally live, maybe, you know, you're a bit more reticent about drinking water out of a tap. I mean, is that true, Randall?
If you listen to the newspaper, they say it's totally safe, but I think very few people do drink the tap water.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, you know, so we have to be careful about, everybody has a different idea of water and clean water, but we can't avoid the fact that without clean water, we just can't live. Let's go to the next chart. The reason why we're talking about this in reality is because of, I guess, this chart, which is one that I shared with Steve maybe 6 months ago or more, when we were looking at, for some clients, about longer term trends that they had to be aware of and do something about. And then I shared this with Randall and sort of had that same reaction of like, wow, you know, and like what the chart is of two parts. On the left-hand side, you have to realize that we live in a world where more and more countries are going to have big water shortages. And yes, if you happen to live in one of the countries that is a yellow and there's low water shortages, well, just wait. I notice, I laugh, not laugh, it's a bit sad that Egypt and the Sudan, for example, according to this particular chart, are, you know, relatively well off, but that's only because, you know, the Nile keeps on flowing. What happens when one country decides to put a tap on that, you know, or shove the plug in the sink and dam it off? But more importantly, on the right-hand side, early on in the COVID crisis, a friend of mine in Bangladesh sent me this chart. If you don't recognize it, it's the shape of Bangladesh. And the point that this chart was that if you follow the usual guidelines we hear about washing your hands for 20 seconds so many times a day, that will actually massively contribute to a shortage of water, even in a country like Bangladesh, which we think of as water rich because they have massive monsoons. But the reality is that, you know, the simple act of washing your hands 2 or 3 times a day properly will drastically reduce the amount of fresh water available in the country. So simple things. And we often hear those analogies about, you know, like if you just drink one more glass of water a day, that'd be, if everybody in the country did that, they'd be healthier. But then you have to put into context that if you live in a country of, say, Thailand with, you know, 70+ million people, and they all drink one extra glass of clean water a day, that's a lot of water that you've got to find, right?
And I mean, we have rain and we have floods, and yet just days after we started talking about this, it came up in the newspaper that Pattaya had a water shortage. I mean, was almost out of water.
Yeah.
You know, it just boggles your mind. It never came into our, you know, our conversation or our thinking.
No, no. The northeast of the country, Isan, as we call it here in Thailand, has been experiencing drought for almost 2 years. It broke this year, but for the previous 2 years, it was a very, very serious situation. The rice crops were failing, and literally a country which is famous for monsoon and floods, we were absolutely running out of water.
So let's show you a few more charts and we'll scare you with some numbers. Let's keep going. Next chart, please. Of course, we share all these charts with everybody that's listening in now or listen to the video later on. 97% of people in Bangladesh have access to water. That's great. But only 40% have proper sanitation. So what does that mean? Well, if you don't have proper sanitation, it means that wherever you are relieving yourself is going to leak into the water system. 60% of the population in Bangladesh, for example, endure unsafe drinking water. That's water that's polluted by human waste. The availability of water greatly fluctuates throughout the year, and that means that in the hot season, yes, the massive flooding in the wet season, but in the hot season, even in Bangladesh, they have droughts and they find it hard to survive on the water they have. So, you know, one of our team asked the question about water policies. The Bangladesh government is trying to develop a national water policy to ensure that they're using the rainwater better, drinking safe water. Of course, it's a question for every government, and everybody on here should be, you know, well aware that governments are thinking about this. They're aware of the issue. But as companies and as individuals, as brands, we should be thinking about, well, what could we be doing to interface with these shortages? 1 in 3 people globally do not have access to safe drinking water. The chart on the right-hand side comes from, if you go down, and you can see the reference at the bottom, if you go down, there's a very interesting chart that goes through about 150 countries around the world and shows what the average person in each country, how much water they go through in a day. Maybe not surprising, America is top of the list in terms of the amount of water it uses a day. But look at the difference between the US, 156 gallons a day per person, to Mali in North Africa, which is 3 gallons a day. Now, 3 gallons a day, if you start to do the math, means that that's barely enough for what you need to drink and maybe wash your face. And that's about it. And so we have these massive differences. And quite genuinely, one of the reasons that we should be thinking of this in terms of the health industry is that, you know, while in the US and some developed countries might have access to lots of water, and we can use that water to help us with other health aspects as we'll come on later on, in many parts of the world, we have to be thinking about, as the health industry, what are we doing to help to make sure that people can access water in the right way, or use water in a more efficient way? And how are we using water in an efficient way so that they get the best value out of everything, because everything needs water to be produced.
I'd like to kind of highlight that, you know, Dave and I both spend a lot of time looking at the aging, and that's not our topic today, but it's so incredibly obvious and predictable, and yet it's overlooked. So when you know the population age, and you can say, here's what the age is today, and in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, and it's the same issue here with water. When we say, here's how much we have, and here's how much we use, and look how much more we're using, and people are just not talking about it. They're not thinking about it. They're not planning for it.
Yeah. But Randall, do you think it's because there's mixed messages? I mean, on one side, we talk about global warming and the melting of the ice caps and the rising of the sea levels. On the other side, we're saying we're running out of water. How does an average person, an average company, know how to make sense of that? On one side, we have too much water. On the other side, we don't have enough.
I say ignore it and watch TV. You know what I mean? We don't want to deal with it, and it's not urgent in our minds.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's our point today, is to raise awareness, because I think majority of people don't even know. They've never even realized.
Yeah.
And it's shocking. It's shocking.
Yeah, it's sort of scary. I know Randall and I did a session for Mahidol University that he works for a couple of months ago, and we touched on this subject, you know, a lot. And it's sort of interesting, the people I know that listened to that session, and there was somebody listening, Randall, but people that I know that listened to that session were equally as shocked. You know, and it's just amazing to me now, because I've been embedded in the subject for a while, that, you know, if I go next door, in the room next door with my family's having dinner, and give them most of these statistics, they're going to go, really? You know?
Yeah.
It's sort of
I think it goes back to sort of that element of responsibility, that it's not just looking at one thing or another, but it's actually looking at a number of different areas that we need to be mindful of. And definitely, and as we'll see later on, some of the world's biggest companies are starting to focus on this in their strategies. This is something important to consider as we move forward, certainly into the next 4 or 5 years.
So this is rather scary. Again, you can go onto the website. It's down the bottom, and go to the link into this website. It's called the Water Scarcity Clock. There's a lot of interesting information on here, but the main part of this website is this clock is an actual active one. So this was, as around the same time yesterday, the amount of people living in the world that are living in water scarce areas. Water scarce areas being defined as areas where there basically is a threat to them having the minimum amount of water necessary to live. That's nearly 2.5 billion people, or I guess by my calculation, about nearly a third of the world's population. Now, what's interesting is when you watch this clock live, literally another person gets added every second. So it's literally going up by thousands and thousands of people every single day.
Yeah.
And it becomes a really frightening thought about where we're heading in terms of water scarcity. So, we don't have enough. The OECD, according to one of their statistics, said that manufacturing around the world would increase the use of water by 400% in the 50 years between 2000 and 2050. That's scary. The UN Water Development Report says that by 2030, 47% of the world population will live in water-stressed environments. So again, while comfortably I'm sitting here sipping water, we may not all be doing that in the near future. And I think it's the next chart that really impresses Randall.
I think if you think about our kind of manufacturing, that we started out with agricultural societies, and now more and more we're talking about electric vehicles, and we're talking about smartphones, and all of these things have a really large water footprint compared to our basic necessities. And even the basic necessities can be really scary, like wine and coffee. They really consume a lot of water if you factor it all the way in from the production process.
Yeah.
And we'll come to that, right? Now, I know when I first showed you this chart, Randall, your reaction was,
yeah, I mean, I think this is incredible to say, like, holy moly, these are huge cities and places that we know, places that we've been to, so it's much more real than some abstract newspaper article. And some of these are bordered right on the water, but that doesn't mean they have enough water.
Yeah.
We've actually joked about this, that it's not a joke. There have been books and movies and video games that talk about the potential of war over water.
Yes, yeah, definitely. We can only see, the reaction in the way the Singaporean government over the last 20 years has had to react to its relationship with Malaysia and the water supply in Singapore, for example. You've only got to think about, I mean, what impresses me always about a chart like this, and yes, some of these cities may be okay today because they've had a lot of rain in the last couple of months, but they are cities who over time suffer from, they're not getting enough water replacement to continually be able to service the water needs of the city. And one of the other things that always strikes me is we sometimes think of water deprivation as being, oh yeah, that's those people that live in the desert. Oh yeah, if I lived in Arizona, yeah, I get that, right? But it's not. It's, and California, of course, is well documented, especially Southern California. But we forget it's, even places that, Bangalore, if you know where Bangalore and you've ever been in Bangalore in the wet season, it's really wet, but it just can't keep up the water supply it needs. Again, lots of publicity, lots of stories in recent years about different cities, about the crisis they've had, about the top 10 cities in terms of, metropolitans that are suffering from water. You can do a lot of reading about this. Let's go on to the next chart. But over the next 35 years, the world's demand for water will rise by 55%. Now, the problem is, as Steve said earlier on, we're surrounded by water. When the ice caps melt, unfortunately, even though the ice caps are fresh water, they melt directly into the sea. And that doesn't mean that the ocean gets sort of gets freshened into fresh water. It just means that it dissipates into the salt water. So we need more access to fresh water. And where are we going to get that from? Well, groundwater is drying up in terms of subterranean waters. Ice caps are melting into the oceans. We can do a certain amount with converting salt water to fresh water, but the reality is we sometimes forget about the amount of water that's needed to make the energy to convert salt water into fresh water. And so all of these things become a little bit problematic.
Dubai is a great, always lauded as a great example of the ability to use salt water and convert it to fresh water. And you only have to sort of go into the city of Dubai to see how it's developed and what it has become. What's your opinion on that? Is that the future? Do we see ourselves being sort of copycats of Dubai?
If you go online, or if people want to let me know, I can direct them to. There's some great videos about that story. Of course, one of the things we have to remember is it's hugely expensive to set up. To set up the conversion plants that convert the salt.
Desalination plants,
Yeah, the desalination. It's very expensive to set them up, and they are then very expensive to run. Now, Dubai has the ability to actually have massive solar energy, but also access to oil that maybe other markets don't have. I know that in countries like Australia, where cities like Perth have set up massive desalination plants that are servicing a part of the water need.
Yeah.
But Perth itself is still struggling to meet its water needs, and so for maybe very resource-rich countries. Maybe okay. For those that are less wealthy countries, very problematic how you're going to do that with current technologies.
And
okay.
If we don't have access to a stable stream of water like the ocean, then as Steve mentioned, we've got these changing kind of weather patterns. So like you said, maybe we have drought where we did not in the past, or suddenly we had rain. We had rain in November in Thailand. It's very unusual.
Yes.
So uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty.
Yes, indeed.
Next chart, please. Hello? Yeah. We also have to remember how much water we all need.
We are water in many ways.
Right. So, the amount of water each individual needs, roughly, let's say this is correct, and you can work out, there's some basic modeling how you can do it. Whether it's 3 litres a day, for example, is commonly put around. But you have to take on board with that, that's an average. So Randall is a good, 4 inches taller than me. Does he need more water than I have? Steve and I may be the same height, but slightly different body shape. Do we have the same water needs, et cetera, et cetera? And then you have to take on things like health, age, et cetera. So I am personally always surprised that if I go into a pharmacy and ask a pharmacist, how much water do I need to consume in a day? I think Steve and I, you and I discussed this, that nobody would ever give me an answer, right? It'll be some generic thing, right? But it would be interesting thing that as you service customers, are you giving some simple tips on how much water they specifically need? Obviously, if you're on certain medications, you might need more water, but how much water, et cetera, right? So,
well, it's interesting that on a lot of the health apps at the moment on your smart watches, there is a function for just tracking how much water you drink. So, as part of a sort of a healthy diet, it is important. And therefore now with our health apps, we're able to track that to make sure that we are drinking enough. But that question of how much is enough is interesting.
Right.
Yeah. But it'll be interesting if we get on to, what does it mean really for our health and wellness? Because ultimately it's a key ingredient for health and wellness, as well as a key ingredient for the production of products for health and wellness.
You know, the thing here is that, you know, water is the cornerstone of wellness. It's also the opportunity for more involvement from different, you know, different types of health and wellness companies and brands. So let's go to the next chart, and maybe I can explain what we mean by it. You know, wellness has been one of the hot subjects of the last 5 years, 10 years. We've talked a lot about on this series, et cetera, in different ways. We know that wellness is always treated very positively. It's a timeless subject. It's not going to go away. It's something that, you know, is embedded now in the way in which we start to think about health and wellness, you know, and the pharma industry, et cetera, et cetera. We want a more general wellness life. Well, let's think about the fact that water is basically, it is the basis of wellness. And I'll give you an example. So I was involved in a piece of research earlier this year where we looked at 150 narratives around the world connected to wellness, and using an AI platform, we ranked those 150 narratives. And you can see here the list of the top 10 narratives around wellness. Now, I don't want to go through the whole list and explain what they all mean, but look at the top three: food quality, nutrition, healthy skin and wellness, gut health and wellness. And I just want to point out that water is key to all of those. Now, the wellness industry has really taken a focus on, you know, the quality of nutrition. Obviously, quality and nutrition of food is the basis of wellness. Healthy skin is a very topical area in the wellness industry. And gut health is like the hot subject that we discover, the hottest subject in terms of the wellness world. But the truth is, you can't have a healthy gut unless you have access to clean water.
No, this whole area is super hot, as you say, Dave. I think we've been so probiotics, for example, has been shooting up. Vitamins, minerals, and supplements has of course shot up with people looking for strengthening immunity. And the gut has become, if you like, and probably has always been, but all of a sudden it's been the focus of the health and wellness industry. Okay, thank you. We've got a bit of a problem with Dave's sound, and I think we've just lost it because of, I guess he's got some bandwidth issues. Randall, do you want to pick up on some of Dave's slides while we wait for him to reconnect?
I mean, I'm much more on the consumer behavior side, but in terms of sustainability, SDG number 12, they talk about sustainable production and sustainable consumption. So I tend to focus a lot more on the consumption side, but we were discussing informally about the production side, and we started to generate some questions which we don't actually know the answers to. But let's say if we were going to produce something like a capsule versus a tablet, you know, how much difference is there in the water consumption? This is a question I don't know the answer to, but I think it's very interesting to explore.
Yeah, well, it goes back to, you know, the consumer focus. Obviously, whatever we decide to use as a format for a health and wellness product or solution has to be something that consumers will find convenient, easy to take, something that will inspire them to take it on a regular basis if it's a more preventive solution. But if you have a choice of whether it's a sachet or a capsule or a tablet, then you might look at the water element of those, and you might make a decision to go with, say, a capsule, which maybe takes less water than others. And I'm not saying that that is the case, because that's a piece of information that we still need to investigate. But actually understanding and being mindful of the water consumption of different formats is really important.
Yes, I am back. Sorry about that.
Yes, you are, and perfect, because I was going to have trouble explaining this one. You better explain it for us then.
Sorry about that. A little bit of it. Maybe the water supply company is upset with me because they're cutting off my internet. Anyway, e-commerce obviously has been a big issue this year, and we've got used to what we've called a come-to-you economy, where every form of service is now brought to you at home or brought to your office or brought to you wherever you are. And we sometimes forget about, well, actually, all of that coming to your economy actually is very, very water expensive. It drives, it's all driven by the use of much more water. Let me show you what I mean by the next chart. Think about home delivered food. So all of us, I guarantee, that are watching this have got more food delivered, no matter what the COVID circumstances we've lived in the last 6 to 12 months. We've all been getting more and more home delivered food. We sometimes forget that all that home delivered food uses up a lot of water. So whether or not you're getting home delivered finished meals or you're getting home delivered the ingredients for meals, think about the cost in terms of plastics, in terms of the way in which the delivery system, the use of fuel, the petrol, etc. But remember, all of those things involve water as well. The picture on the right, for example, I was in quarantine here in Sydney for 2 weeks, and that was the plastics used in delivering my meals 2-3 times a day for 2 weeks. Now, that's a lot of plastic packaging, but as Randall often points out, all that plastic packaging actually involves a lot of water, right? And we sometimes forget about the way in which lifestyles have changed this year, but actually increased the usage of water through those sorts of delivery systems.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of our jokes that we had been really cracking down on the plastic bags until COVID came along. And then suddenly everything's extra wrapped in plastic. The utensils are wrapped in plastic. The napkins are wrapped in plastic. And now we have, it seems like 5 times more plastic. And that's not even the production side. That's just consuming it. So it's like, wow, we were making 1 or 2 steps forward, and now we've gone about 5 steps backwards in the name of hygiene and COVID.
Yeah, and so as you can see quite clearly, that involves an awful lot of plastic that we're sort of using up. So, and that involves a lot of water. Where that leads us is to thinking about, the fact that we are also developing a lot of systems to help people find better nutrition, find easier ways to absorb nutrition, etc. I often use this example from Nestle in Japan, where they developed a system primarily originally focused at caregivers to help older Japanese people, where the caregiver could take a photo of the food that older people were eating. They'd send that photo to Nestle. Rather, Nestle supplied an app that automatically told them what was the nutritional value of that foodstuff, what nutritional elements were missing, and then Nestle would supply sachets that could be put into instant green tea makers that would supplement what was missing in the older person's diet. That's all very well and good. It was actually an idea that came about by them talking to one of their packaging suppliers about, and it sounds like a great story. But if you go to the next chart, what we have to remember about that story is that it's actually about putting more food inside a liquid. In this case, it was green tea. It could be inside any liquid. And one of the things that we've noticed over the last 10, 15 years has been more and more, not just health drinks in terms of juices, etc., but beverages and drinks that you can buy at a pharmacy, for example, that will add collagen to your diet, for example, famously, or other beauty treatments, other skincare treatments, other health supplements, etc. And we have to think about infused waters and infused drinks. But we often say, okay, but now you can drink this and you can drink that. And we have to put that into the context of what is people's overall water consumption. And should we be thinking about how we can add products to their existing water consumption rather than asking them to drink other drinks? What do I mean by that? Well, I spent many years working on the advertising for Coca-Cola brands across Asia. And a simple model that was developed many years ago was that if you're asking people to start drinking orange juice, you have to take on board what are they going to stop drinking? Because there's only so much we can drink in a day. But the opportunities are there to use the different, the water and the different liquids people are consuming to perhaps get across other benefit products through that supply.
Just building on that, I think this was also a challenge given to us by Araksha and Taisho from DSM in the last webinar, where they were talking about nutrients and nutritious supplements for food supplements for the aging, and as we get older, we need different supplements. And one of those challenges was, how can we integrate food supplements into a daily diet, not as an additional pill, but maybe as a powder that you can then sprinkle on in your soup, or something which can basically integrate into your normal eating or drinking habits. And I think that's a great idea, because if you think about it, then it does cut out part of that issue of transporting water from one place to another in the form of a bottle of medicine or whatever the case might be. But it also, is very much more purple or person-centric. Yes. To basically, thinking about the way they live their lives and integrating in this supplement into a person's normal life. And I think that's a great challenge when we start thinking about different formats that we want to introduce into our assortment.
Right, exactly. So how do you bring in products that are easily dissolved in people's existing water usage?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, not to forget that the lifespan has increased by about 10 years.
Yes.
So that's putting quite an additional burden on everything.
Yes, yes.
Now, of course, some categories are already embedded in tracking, right? We're seeing already a world where tracking where things come from, and coffee is a great example, where in the coffee industry, we've got used to in the last 10 years through the actions of many brands that, you can get sites where you can track where the coffee was grown and which side of the mountain it was. And this was, part of it was fair trade led. Part of it was basically, I drink superior coffee because it comes from this location there. But the point is, if you go to the next chart, that 2020 and COVID has led to us all getting used to having apps that track us and track so many things. And one of the things that's going to lead to is more and more water tracking, or water footprint tracking, or water footprint apps. We've already seen that, particularly perhaps the big FMCG companies, and Nestle is a good example, Coca-Cola, etc. Those big beverage companies have already had to put in water sourcing, not necessarily easy to download apps, but water sourcing information, etc., as part of their websites, as part of their public policies, etc. They've had to do it because they really impact, large-scale water usage in some towns and cities around the world. But it's going to affect everybody.
So basically, we're shifting. Everyone's become familiar with the carbon footprint, but now we are starting to think about a water footprint.
Yeah.
Right. And it's an interesting thing. And on the far right side, again, early this year, Steve and I were doing some consultancy on big trends for a couple of beauty brands and or beauty-related brands. And one of the things that we pointed out was that a small jar of skin cream takes a lot of water. Its footprint in terms of the water used in the ingredients, the development of the ingredients, in terms of the production of the actual product, of the packaging, of the shipment, etc. When you start to look at it, it's a very small jar, but it's 70 plus liters of water. And if you go online, you'll find a number of sites that will highlight examples like this of, 3,500 gallons of water for the smartphone you might be watching this webinar on. That's a lot of water, right? And so we start to get really into, having to think about, well, where is all this water coming from? And more companies are going to be asked and be checked. I mean, if you think about high-end cosmetic products, people very quickly are going to start turning around and sort of saying, yeah, but how much water does it take to get there? For me to get a few ounces of cream that might help moisturize my skin, wow, it's going to take 70, 80 liters of water to do that. That sounds ridiculous in some ways, right? And so people will be questioned about that. One of the most interesting sites I've come across in recent times has been this one, which is the Water Footprint Network. This is a live site where what they do is you can go onto that site and look at a few hundred different items, and it will tell you the amount of water that is used in the production of, in the complete development of the ingredients, the production, the shipment of those things. So you can see there that, you know, a glass of wine, a cup of coffee, for example, you know, involve an awful lot of water, you know, 100+ litres of water to get a single glass of red wine. A leather carry bag is thousands of litres of water, thousands and thousands of litres of water. And so what will happen quite quickly is that we believe is that companies are going to be forced to have water policies and water footprints for each of their items, because more and more concerned groups, and admittedly at first it's always very concerned groups, and that becomes more public and it becomes more newsworthy as to what is the water footprint of your particular product, your particular service.
And it can be very counterintuitive, because you think about, well, I'm going to have a hamburger. You say, well, the hamburger came from beef. Well, what did they feed the beef? And that took a lot. Dave talked about Coca-Cola, and you say, well, Coke is just a small can or a small bottle. You know, what's the big deal? You say, well, what did they make the sugar from? Maybe it came from sugar beets. And how much water did that take? And, you know, it's a lot.
It soon adds up. And the other thing is, of course, to look at it in a more positive light. I think, yes, it takes that much, but how much of it are we able to recycle and reuse? And that's where, you know, it might be sort of dramatizing, of course, the amount of water that is used, but you can start to offset by recycling. You can start to offset by water retention schemes. You can, you know, there are positive things you can do. You don't have to give up your wine forever, for example.
No, you don't. But what you have to do is to take on board what all these things mean. And as you say, then create policies, create awareness about what you're doing to try to solve issues, etc. So this all creates opportunities for companies, of course, but also problems. There is a lot of material. If you Google it, you're going to find there's a lot of material about what pharmaceutical companies could or should be doing around water usage, water wastage, or reducing it, reusing water, etc. These are great examples. I really recommend that people just do a little bit of reading about this and look at some of it. I want to take you through a couple of examples, I think, of things I found in a recent search. One of the things is that a lot of big pharmaceutical companies, a lot of big companies of all types around the world, now if you dig into their websites, you will find there are water policies. There is a page somewhere, usually, you know, when you finally find the sustainability section, then eventually underneath the sustainability, you're going to find, well, we have a water policy. The beware of this is that having a water policy is fine, but of course, if you put it into print, what your water policy is, you better live up to what that policy is.
You have to,
or you're going to get caught out, right? So people are very quick to spot the fault these days and then share it. So be careful of that. But it is encouraging to see a lot of, not just Novartis, but a lot of companies actually starting to have water policies in terms of not where they're sourcing, how they're responsibly using it, how they're reusing water, reducing water usage, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I found interesting is things like ideas like ZLD, which is all about some policies that some companies are starting to use in terms of, you know, how to reuse water, how to think about the turning effluent or wasted water back into reusable sources in their factories, etc. And these are becoming more and more common talked about policies, more and more common talked about manufacturing capabilities, but perhaps they're not reaching down to the public and not reaching down to you know, public interest enough in terms of how we're sharing that information. One of the biggest issues, we touched on this, is where is the water going to come from? Quite simply, you know, water has to come from natural resources, and for the most part. And so we are going to see more and more squeeze on those resources. And so we have to be careful as manufacturers or as brands, as companies, or talking about where we're getting our water from and where that sourcing is coming from. I don't mean in terms of, oh, we're getting it from the most natural spring, but, you know, are we a major net exporter or importer of water? Not just on a country basis, but as we move products around the world. You know, the old thing about Fiji water was, yeah, Fiji water, remember that brand, might have been the purest, most beautiful water in the world. But to get a litre of water on your table, wherever you lived in the world, actually cost, you know, something like 100 litres to ship it. You know, it was ridiculous. So we have to be careful of those things. So we wanted to think about, you know, some of the things that you should be thinking about as, or brands and companies should be thinking about in terms of what they could do about water. For example, you know, pharmacists could be asking a bunch of questions. You know, in terms of, you know, are you hungry or thirsty? Truth is that a lot of people actually say they're hungry when they're actually thirsty. And there's a lot of science around this about the fact that we tend to, when a glass of water would actually satisfy us, we eat things, we snack, etc., etc.
Interesting.
And we'd be better off if we just drank an extra glass of water. We actually would eat less, for example. Are you working out or not? A simple question. But the simple thing is that I could be the same body weight as Steve, the same body shape as Steve, roughly the same age as Steve, but because Steve works out 5 to 10 hours a week more than I, his water consumption, he may need to use a lot more water than I do for water replacement. Drinking for weight loss is a big issue. Are pharmacists really helping people understand that? How are pharmacists helping people understand their water usage and their health issues? So if you're asthmatic, for example, that has certain relevance in terms of how much water you need and how regularly you should be drinking water. Asthma can be triggered by water shortage or dehydration in your body, for example. Medications, which medications require you to drink more water, etc. And you can't just say, oh, make sure you drink a glass of water every time you take these pills. What you should be saying is, what is your normal water consumption? How frequently do you drink? What extra water do you need to take in because of this type of medication? So there's a possibility for water to become a key advisory that the whole health and industry could be involved in different ways. And then that opportunity opens up things for, as Steve mentioned before, which is products that can be added to water, you know, that involve a smaller water footprint because they are maybe just smaller dried powders, etc., that easily dissolve. It could be opportunities for new types of products and services that a pharmacist could be putting through, which leads us to the next chart, which is
our salty diets.
Yeah, you know, it's just thinking, well, exactly. What do you normally eat? I mean, if you're doing a lot of salty food, I mean, quite obviously you probably need to drink more water, right? Steve and I, you know, and some of our other things that we've been doing, we're using this basic format that we call TIP, you know, trends, insight, and application. But you can actually see here that there's quite obviously a bunch of things that we could be doing in terms of, you know, COVID has heightened the awareness of health and wellness. Great. But the insight really is, what are you actually doing in terms of water consumption over this time, and how could we help ourselves, right? So that leads us to the next chart, which is quite simply some considerations that we thought maybe companies should have. You know, how much water, you know, think about people's behavior and consumer behavior, how much water you're using to deliver services to them, and how much water they're using, and how you can help them understand what they should be doing. Considering everything like packaging, etc., what you're doing in terms of water consumption, what is your real water footprint, and what are the options you have? And you know, as we all come back to, and we've all come back to in different ways, sustainability means basically everything living together, and no matter what we call it. And I like Steve's opening comment about that. So I think that's, you know, the key thing here is that we want to make sure that people are thinking better about bringing water into the total mix of how you can expand your business, offer new services, but also how you can be more efficient in the use of water going forward.
Great, thank you. We've come to the end of the time, but I think I'm just going to ask one question of both of you, which is, how is it that as a company, as a health and wellness company, as health and wellness brands, we can influence, say, government policy, or should we be influencing more consumer behavior in terms of that? Where should we be focusing? Because obviously this is a critical issue, a burning bridge, and we need to be doing things about it. But Randall, maybe I ask you first, what would be your advice to the industry?
I think if they take away our choice, then the consumer behavior will be forced to change. But personally, between the two, I would prefer to focus on consumer behavior change rather than government mandates. But it's all incremental. It all starts from each and every one of us. And we've heard this, I'm sure, all of our lives. Turn off the water when you're brushing your teeth or when you're shaving or whatever. It just needs to become real. It needs to be very visible now that it's truly becoming a big issue. We're running out of time. I don't think there's really a right answer for that. But businesses can certainly make a bigger, more drastic change more quickly, and yet in mass, there's more consumers out there.
Absolutely. It's about, I mean, it has to be also about the way that we change ourselves every day. Absolutely. Dave, what about you? Which way would you go?
Well, I think government, as I said, I think governments are more than aware of the core issue, how effective governments are at doing anything about it, as broad as there are different types of governments around the world and the different competencies of government. So not my place to understand or complain about that. I think in terms of what companies could do, they should be influencing governments. Certainly big companies should be influencing the future. I mean, access to water is fundamental to any manufacturing industry you're in, no matter what you're manufacturing. No matter what service you provide, you have to have water to basically provide a service. And so it's in your own interest to secure, what is the future of water supplies, etc. But I think the other big opportunity is to look at additional products and services. And, one of the interesting things that I know all three of us have talked about many times is that many companies are adding more and more service areas to not just producing products, not just producing pills or tablets or potions, but they're adding services. For companies, biggest opportunity is the fact that every company in the world seems to be focused on adding services. No matter what you manufacture or deliver, you're adding more and more services. And maybe a key service that every company could be looking at is helping its consumers understand water in much greater ways.
Okay.
Right. Addressing more health, etc.
Very good. Thank you. And I've noticed, of course, that we've got other questions and observations coming in. What we'll do is the team will be able to sort of bring that together. We'll make sure the questions are answered by our presenters, and we'll get them out to you together with a link to the recording of this webinar. But I just want to say thank you so much to Randall and, of course, Dave. And thank you to all of you. And I'm going to hand over now, I think, back to Emma, who's going to just tell us a little bit about what's coming up. Emma.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. So thank you so much for such a brilliant webinar, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Before we sign off, we would love to invite you to our 2021 kickoff, the next webinar in the 2021 Health and Wellness Will Be Different webinar series on January 13th. The only way to get things done is in Teams. A discussion about practical collaboration by Alison James, founder of Ambidextrous. Next month, we will unite and investigate the significance of practical collaboration, getting to know the Let's Go collaboration model, a meta model that combines and connects ideas and best practice. Jump in and learn how we can harness each dynamic to great results, taking into account your context and challenges and nurturing your ideas and business in the collaborative system together. So following the webinar today, you'll all receive an invitation to register with this, alongside, as Steve said, the recording and any questions that we weren't able to answer. So on behalf of the Consumer Healthcare Training Academy team, we would like to say a big thank you to Dr. Randall, Dave and Steve for making this session so insightful, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon and evening wherever you are, and we hope to see you all again in January. See you next year. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.